Methods of development, comparison, and contrast. Today we're going to take a look at the criteria for effectively using comparison and contrast. First, of course, we have to choose our two subjects. Now keep in mind that your subjects must be similar enough to be usefully compared and contrasted, and with that being said, we also don't want them to be too similar that there's no reason to contrast them. So take a look at this. If I take this shoe and maybe that football that's sitting over there in the corner and say, how about these? Well, that would be kind of silly because they're just so different that there's really no point in comparing them. We would only really be sort of grabbing at straws, trying to find some details of where they are the same. How about my black flip-flops and my pink flip-flops? These are both sandals. They're both a similar kind of shoe, except they're just so similar that the only real difference is the color, and then that just boils down to my preference for color. So that would not be useful either. But take this one, a moped and a street bike. Now both of these are a method of transportation, and both of them fall into sort of a category of a motorcycle. Of course, they're very different in the cost and the size and the speed and many other factors, and now we have the basis for comparing and contrasting. The same thing goes for this, a cat and a dog. Both animals are so different, yet they're both common household pets, and they have a lot of similarities, and so it would be worthwhile comparing and contrasting. So basically, your two subjects should be either different models or versions or brands of the same thing, or it could be two different things, but they're still in the same category. So the next thing to consider is your purpose, of course. Why are you comparing these subjects? Now, I'm going to mostly just say comparing because it gets a little redundant saying compare and contrast every time, but you know what I mean. So, are you trying to make a decision and pick one? Are you explaining your preference as to why you chose one or the other? Maybe you're better trying to understand your two subjects, possibly to make a future decision, or are you hoping to give insight to your reader about your subjects? It's really important that you know why you're doing this before you start writing. So let's get started with two topics here. How about cats and dogs, going from what we had last? And the purpose for this particular comparison is just going to be to better understand each one as a pet. Now we'll start with the Venn diagram. These are those two circles who overlap, and we basically put on one side the cats, on the other side the dogs, and in the middle we'll do the similarity. So let's start in the middle. We know that there are furry friends. They're known for that. We can get them for free. Sometimes from a friend. We can even pick the one up at the grocery store at times when someone's trying to give away their puppies or their kittens before their parents get mad. Or we can buy them. They do take money to care for, especially with food and of course things like going to the vet for shots or if they get hurt. And regardless, we are going to have to feed them, which means money and time, and they're going to poop. And unfortunately, this is the worst part about having a pet, is cleaning up after them, in my opinion. So let's start with the cats. We'll throw some information up there. We talk about their size. We talk about, again, the fact that there's cheaper options. A lot of times people tend to get the cats fairly cheap from a friend, from a neighbor, and for not much money, but they can be very expensive cats for certain breeds. They usually clean up after themselves, but we do have to clean up for them a little bit, like with the litter box. They can be playful, but not all the time. They're fairly independent, and we'll just keep adding some information up there. Now, when we add the information for the dog, we want to try to match what we have on the other side so that we continue with the same kind of information. So when we throw that up there, we talk about how in regard to size, they kind of range. You can have a very small dog and a very large dog. We talk about the price. They can be very expensive to buy. Most of the time, people tend to buy a dog, and it can be somewhat inexpensive from someone you know, or if they're very well bred, it can be quite pricey. They do need groomed and bathed, and this can either be something you do on your own, or you could pay to have it done. They're very playful. Of course, they can cost money if they begin to eat your shoes, and that's never good. They're very dependent on their owners, but very friendly, and they definitely need a lot of attention, which can be a positive thing because it's a lot of fun, but it can be a big responsibility. Now, once we have our information up there, we need to think about our points of comparison. What we want to be careful of is just throwing out a ton of information about our two subjects without any way of organizing it or really having a grounds for comparison. You don't want to say that a cat cleans up after itself, but a dog plays with a ball. Those are just two different facts. So our points of comparison are going to be the basis for which we use to compare. So we might talk about cost. For example, a cat is a little bit cheaper to buy. We can get them for free. People tend not to be as worried about buying a well-bred cat. A dog, on the other hand, while we can bring home a stray dog, and I have done that once or twice in my lifetime, most of the time people want to know where they're coming from, maybe any kind of medical history and things like that, depending on the breed, and they can be more expensive. So one point we could talk about is the cost to attain or to own this dog or cat. So that would be an example of how to get to the point of comparison, and you would want to keep doing that looking at your information here. So once again, you must have points of comparison because these are the basis for comparing and contrasting. They're sort of like the subtopics or the little mini topics that you're going to talk about. Also, you have to choose the right method of organization. Which way will you organize your information? Now, the first one is called point by point. This is a little bit more sophisticated, and I think it's a little bit more effective. You basically start out with your first point of comparison, and for us, let's just say that was the cost to acquire the pet and to take care of the pet, and you would give information for both subject 1 and subject 2. So for cats and dogs, what are the similarities and the differences regarding cost? Then you would move on to your second point, and you would talk about both cats and dogs, and you would go back and forth, and then you would move on to a third point and do the same and go as long as you needed to. Now the next one is called the block method, and it seems very simple, but I also think it can be a bit more difficult than it appears. Now on this one, you take subject 1, which is your cat, and you talk about the first, the second, and third point and more if there are, and you talk about the cost, and then you talk maybe if the second point is about the time it needs to care for the pet, and if the third point is about, the things you can teach this pet and train them to do. Now you have those 3 points. You give all the information for the cat. Now the problem here is it sounds a lot like you're listing information. So in order to make it seem more sophisticated, you have to make sure that when you get to subject 2, which are your dog, that you go back and forth, and you might say, while the cat had done this, the dog does this. And people kind of forget to do that, and it just sounds like a chunk of listed information followed by a chunk of listed information. So that's one of the reasons why I say the point by point is a little bit more effective. It reminds you that you should be going back and forth and using some of those transition phrases and words like we'll talk about a little bit later. So keep this in mind. Now, we have that information. We're going to outline our points of comparison and our organization. So we said that one point could be the cost. What does it cost to get this pet and to take care of it? A second could be how much time it takes to care for the pet and the ability to teach and train the pet. Now, these are our 3 points, and then we're going to kind of just remind ourselves of the information we have. So on the cost for the cat, it can be free, it can be inexpensive, it can be pricey if it's something special, and then of course we have the cost of food and litter. On the side for the dog, it is better to purchase usually just for medical reasons. So the prices range. It can be a few $100s all the way to thousands of dollars. And then of course we have money for food and toys. Now for time to care, we have information for the cat and we have information for the dog. And then we move on to ability to teach and train, and we have, again, information for the cat and information for the dog. Now, some of these things have similar points, and some of them are different, but now we can kind of see what we're going to do. Now, remember, this is where we want to decide how we are going to organize our information. If we take our point of there in blue on the cost and we go from left to right, we will have the point-by-point method of comparison. But if we take basically everything down the left-hand side for the cat, that would be block, and then we block it with all the information for the dog on the right-hand side. Now, Once we've decided that, one other thing that you should remember too is this is just the kind of the skeleton of your piece of writing. You still want to elaborate on these details and give examples and narrations and things like that too. So we want to make a claim. Remember, identify your two subjects so we know what your topics are. You want to make a reference to your purpose. Again, why are you doing this? You don't have to come out and say, I am doing this because. In fact, I would not recommend that. But you want to hint at the fact that you're making a decision, or just that there are two things to be understood better. You want to include your points of comparison, and this is optional. And you always want to consider what you want your reader to know, again, those details and facts about your subjects, and the believe, which is sort of the bigger picture or message if you have one. So let's take a look at some examples that you can kind of see how yours measure up to. Now this is a poor example. It says cats and dogs can both be pets. Well, we already know that. You're really not giving me any kind of insight, and it's just a factual statement, and this is not a claim. The second one, cats and dogs are very different. Now, you're kind of making a claim, but I think pretty much people would say, well, yes, they are. What is your point there? This is not helpful. This one's a little bit better. It says, when it comes to cats and dogs as pets, there are both similarities and differences to know about. Now, this one identifies the fact that we are going to examine the cats and dogs, and I believe it hints at a purpose. I'm thinking it's to understand them a little bit better. It's not amazing and fantastic, but it's doing the job. Now, this is much better. It says, while cats and dogs are both common pets to have, their differences show how much better it is to have a dog. So this one would explain the preference of this person in having a dog. It could have included the points of comparison that would also tell us what we're going to talk about. And this one does that. It says, before deciding on whether to get a cat or a dog for a pet, it is important to understand how they compare in regard to cost to attain and own, time needed to care for, and ability to teach and train. Now this one, the purpose is not to explain the preference, but to understand them better, and it's going to do so based on these 3 points of comparison, possibly to eventually make a decision. So in both of these great examples, we have a purpose. It's very clear. The first one is to make a decision, or to show why I've made that decision, and the second one is to increase understanding, and that one includes the points that it will be talking about. So let's get to writing. Again, begin with your claim and keep your purpose in mind. Try the point-by-point organization, so you'll begin with the first point. You will definitely want to use transitions, and here are some reminders over here. You want some that will be words that can help you show similarities, whether you use the word similarly or also or likewise. This one does that. When you're contrasting, you can use words like however, or on the other hand. You can also in that same sentence say this one does that, whereas this one does that. But these will help your reader see the similarities and differences, and it will help your writing flow. Then you'll continue through each of the other points, giving the information for both of your subjects. And of course, we cannot forget to use the other methods of development to present your information and achieve your purpose. There's nothing better for giving an example of what you mean. So if you're talking about cost, give me an example of how much it would cost to buy a certain breed, if you have that knowledge. Or give me an example of a personal experience, maybe a narrative about what you taught your particular dog to do once. So think about the cause and effect, think about narration, exemplification, any of the other description methods that are helpful for you to give your information so it doesn't sound like a list, and so that it develops your point. Good luck to you.